Okay, today, my guest is Professor Helena Barnard. I'll keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Helena as a person, Professor Barnard is a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally, as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Professor Barnard was the VP of for administration at AIB. She developed the proposal for first ever OEM conference outside of North America in Johannesburg. She sits on the editorial board of Global Strategy Journal, IEE Transactions in Engineering Management, and Academy of Management Perspectives. She was recognized by the National Research Foundation South Africa as an internationally recognized scholar, and she was a co-editor of a special issue in Journal of International Management. She received the Nutholz Prize for best paper in the ISPM conference in Poland. Thank you, Helena, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Oh, a teacher. And it doesn't matter what identity I imagine myself to have. If I travel through a rural part of the country, I think I would have been the principal of the school here. Or if I go to a museum, I think I would have been one of those women who started the school for girls. So in many ways, I am what I imagined I would be growing up.
Interesting. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Pretoria in South Africa, was born actually in KwaZulu-Natal, but my parents moved to Pretoria pretty soon thereafter.
And your education was?
University of Pretoria. Other than my PhD that was at Rutgers, I have been at the University of Pretoria all my life. My primary school literally borders the university. And my first time going to the university was to go and visit children's theatre that was put on at the drama department. When I came back from the States, I was hoping to go to a more sophisticated city. Pretoria is not known to be a very cutting-edge city. So I decided I'll go to Johannesburg because there was this new business school, the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And then I discovered it was the business school of the University of Pretoria that had moved to Johannesburg because that's where most business happens. But other than my time at Rutgers, that is where I've been all my life.
And how did you choose academia, actually international business in academia?
You know, I grew up during the 70s and 80s in what turned out to be the end days of apartheid. But it didn't feel like the end days of apartheid at the time. South Africa was extremely violent. Thousands of people were being killed all the time. And globally, it was a pariah. White South Africans were not allowed up north into the rest of Africa. There were economic sanctions. There was a cultural boycott, an academic boycott. So it felt incredibly isolated. And there was this constant sense of what is happening out there, even as a primary school child. It was people whose parents could afford to go to Europe for a holiday or vacation, as you say. We were envious of those children who had a view beyond. So I think it came from that persistent interest in what happens beyond our borders.
Interesting. Something that is not on your CV that people might find interesting.
The white settlers arrived in South Africa in 1652. The first of my ancestors to arrive in South Africa arrived in 1653. And the last of the lot arrived in 1735. Everybody since then have been born in the country. And I often think about that when Americans challenge me about my Africanness. I checked the other day, and the last of my ancestors arrived in South Africa 150 years before Ellis Island started operating. So my roots in the country go 3.5 centuries deep. And yeah, I can trace, when I walk in the country, it feels to me as if I hear echoes from so many stories from so many generations.
Super interesting. If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would you do? What's the second best alternative career path for you?
Teaching.
Okay.
I cannot imagine myself doing anything other than teaching. I love the research component, but I am quite sure that in a different life or in a different world, I would be happy as a teacher in a high school, maybe of languages or so. So yeah, I cannot see myself outside of education.
Regrets? Have you got any regrets?
It feels to me that we live a life that is a journey, and we are trying to do something useful on this journey. And regrets are only regrets if something that we tried and that didn't work isn't able to teach us something. So I have stupid regrets, like my father was an excellent dancer, and he tried to teach me to dance when I was a teenager, and I was just too stubborn to learn to dance from my father. And I wish I could have stuck it out and been as good as dancer as he was. But he's, passed on, and I'm a grown woman. But the regrets that the other things in my life that didn't work out, I often feel there's a lesson in there that I can take with me.
And now you started taking dancing lessons?
Yes, my husband and I actually did a tango at our wedding. I'm not a good dancer at all. And we decided to do an opening dance, and the dancing instructors said to us, she can sit, and then she can look at you, and then you can walk over to her. And that's 16 seconds where you don't have to move at all, which I think explains how ungood I am at dancing. But we have a fabulous time.
Perfect. Well, what are you most passionate about?
I think scholarship in Africa. I think it's such a fascinating continent. It is so understood and misunderstood that for me, both learning about the continent and helping to figure out what's going on here, helping develop capacity on the continent, I really live the life that I love doing.
Okay, let's switch to research segment. Let's talk about research. How do you explain your research, and why your research is important to people who don't read your work regularly?
Cool. Well, as I've already said, it's Africa focused. And what I'm trying to understand is, how does business and management work on the African continent in particular, but specifically when there's a gap in development between the countries who engage in cross-border business. So I'm interested in South Africa doing business with Sweden, but also with South Africa doing business with Senegal. So as long as there's a difference in the level of development of the countries, and it involves cross borders, I'm curious about how does that process of business take place.
I mean, in the interview with Lilac Nahum, we talked about Africa quite a bit. And I want to ask you the same line of questions specific to Africa. What are some of the omitted variables, understudied areas that will further IB research?
So, I don't even think it's a case of omitted variables. It feels to me that there's certain features of business in Africa that transforms in many ways what business looks like. So one of them is the constant presence of turbulence, instability, uncertainty, tumultuousness. I mean, you can choose the adjectives, but it struck me when I was looking back over my research, I kept on having this as a backdrop. I did a paper with John DeWeese about escape foreign direct investment to make sense of the turbulent political situation in South Africa during apartheid. And I think that turbulence is something that I think needs more scrutiny. It changes something like a time horizon. If you're dealing with hyperinflation like Zimbabwe has been with a weak quality of governance, a whole lot of assumptions that we make about business need to change. That's the one thing. The other thing that I think gets transformed is knowledge. I was trained on knowledge in the multinational. I was John Cantwell's student, and Deborah Dougherty was on my committee. She was a qualitative scholar of innovation, but also John Dunning. I believe I was the last student who was supervised by John Dunning before he fully retired from that. And so you look at knowledge in the multinational, you think you know what's going on there. I do a study on patenting by South Africa's largest R&D spender just as I come back from Rutgers. And you know, I was John Cantwell's student, so I know how patenting works. It turns out that the company, Sasol, did not. And I mean it seriously in the sense that international collaborators will do a lot of work to help create capacity to innovate with emerging market counterparts. But they don't really want to teach you how to capture the value from innovation. So Sasol really was on its own there. But suddenly I realized that a lot of the things that I was assuming that I was reading about in the literature was not happening in the same way. So for Sasol, patenting was really a way to get legitimacy, to maintain international collaboration during the academic boycott and economic sanctions era. So they were hit hard by the isolation, and they used patents in ways that weren't theorized before. I wrote a paper on that, but I keep on coming across the fact that where you are in a context which is underdeveloped and where knowledge is scarce, it assumes all kinds of different guises. People will pretend to know to get power when they don't. And sometimes people know, but it's not visible. So a paper that I did on the value of PhD studies in the developing world, we managed to differentiate between selection effects and training effects in a university. Now this is scholars, this is an academic career, this is international recognition. This one really would assume is about knowledge, not about other processes. And we found that the quality of training by the best regarded South African universities was comparable to the quality of training of the leading international universities. But in terms of the selection effects, which really capture status and prestige, the developing country universities seriously lagged. So for me, it's also interesting to try and understand how knowledge is shaped, shifted, understood. So I think that is important. And then the other thing that I found really often is the case is in terms of the relationship between the individual and the institution. When your institutions are weak, your individuals become more important. And so the role of an individual knowledge broker or entrepreneur or whatever becomes much greater than it would be when the institutional environment is better developed. So what I found, quite to my surprise and dismay actually, was that I was reading up about social psychology to make sense of diasporans from South Africa. I was really quite thrown when I came back to South Africa after my PhD training in the US, because the world was so different. And I tried to, I didn't know what, if my training was on knowledge in the multinational, but that wasn't what I was seeing, what was I supposed to do? And I ended up theorizing what I saw. But I was through institutional theory and social psychology and network theory, and it's really been quite hard for me in some senses to come to terms. And you know, you always advise doctoral students to have a research focus and to focus on a theory base. And because I was emphasizing the phenomenon, and because I was working on scholarship in such an under-researched continent, I didn't do that. And you know you're in trouble when the Google Scholar algorithm doesn't know what to recommend to you to read. It still doesn't know. So I think that at least I've identified those themes around knowledge, around turbulence, around the role of the individual as key themes that certainly inform my own work.
Helena, are we talking about turbulence and uncertainty in all parts of Africa, like the northern part, eastern, western, the south and central part? Are these identical?
No, not at all. Africa has 800 million people, 54 countries, huge diversity. So a country like Botswana, for example, is extremely stable from an institutional perspective, whereas an immediate neighbor, Zimbabwe, is probably the worst on the continent. What is consistent is perhaps, first of all, the very recent colonial history with wounds that go deep, and then a struggle to move forward, to reconcile a history that is often a painful history with some form of modern global business, or just business, in ways that there's, I don't think that low or middle income countries are low or mid average in terms of everything in the country. They are enclaves of excellence, and then also huge swaths of underdevelopment. So you have these enclaves of excellence struggling to make sense of what it is like to operate in a context where many things cannot be taken for granted. Kenya has long surpassed South Africa in terms of digital connectivity, but electricity supply is not terribly reliable. So in some ways, the turbulence is not just institutional, it also comes from a very textured, if you wish, general macro-environmental context.
I want to ask about how does the colonial history in Africa, all parts of Africa, impact these Chinese investments in infrastructure? And also Indians are making investments, obviously, but the Chinese investments are quite different in nature. What can you say?
Yeah, it's a big topic. And the Chinese investment, I mean, there are many tiers of Chinese investors. There's some that are state-backed and the central state-backed, and then there are some that are provincially backed, and then there's small-scale entrepreneurs. So the first thing I think is to be really careful about generalizing Chinese investment as if it's one type of investment. The large projects have focused on infrastructure development, and it has made a difference on the continent. It has made it easier to do business. And I think that matters, and it probably matters for the Chinese in particular, but it also means that a Kenyan can now drive more easily around Nairobi. So I think there are interesting developments there that play out alongside long-standing colonial interests, interested by India, by Lebanese investors sometimes that settle on the west coast of Africa. South Africa itself is a large investor on the continent. So there's a lot of activity on the continent, some of which take the form of foreign direct investment, as IB would understand it, but then also smaller kinds of arrangements. The South African countryside, every small town will have a general dealer that is either Pakistani or Chinese. And they're interesting supply chains that support these dealers in areas that really seem like economic backwaters.
Interesting. Thank you. For the sake of time, I'll switch to the advice section. What was the best advice you received when you were going through the program?
To just keep on going. To the best dissertation is a done dissertation. This is a project. Just there's an expression Afrikaans, byt vas. Just keep on going and wrap it up.
What do you wish you would have known when you were starting out? Maybe some tricks that speed up finishing up projects, finishing up papers. What do you wish you had known earlier?
I think that the one thing that I didn't realize was there's a lot of emphasis on novelty, find a new idea. But as scholars, we are also custodians of knowledge. So because I'm theorizing Africa, the novelty part is never a challenge, or almost never. And what I instead struggled with was reviewers who just didn't believe what I was claiming. When all my African colleagues nodded in absolute agreement, the reviewers would say, no, where's your evidence here? So at first I was frustrated and I thought they have something against African scholarship. But the truth is that because we are custodians for knowledge, we have to hold new insights to a very, very high level of quality, and especially when it challenges existing perspectives. And so I have learned that the methodology, the research design must be superb. This is where you have the evidence, the theorizing. You can tell a story about more or less anything, but what is the anything? And I've really become far more rigorous in terms of pushing myself and pushing our doctoral students to make sure that the evidence base is solid. And of course, it's always hard to find data. It potentially is even harder in Africa, where you have a whole bunch of issues related to underdevelopment. So what I've also learned is that if the data aren't glowing in the dark, perfectly fabulous, don't try and send it to the top journals, because the mission of the top journals is really to pursue that quality. And a suggestive set of evidence is not good enough. So for those journals, it's far more important for papers where the data, in spite of my efforts, ended up being suggestive. It's best not to try and get it into a top tier journal, but to go for a journal that is perhaps not as highly regarded, but where suggestive evidence would be acceptable, provided the rest of the paper is solidly put together. So really, it was a coming to terms with the fact that reviewers must challenge us. This is how we safeguard the knowledge base that we are working with. And if I want to make a contribution on an under-researched world, then my job has to be to make sure that the evidence that I provide, the data, the rigor with which I gather and analyze and report the data, that is above reproach.
I mean, we're talking about an evolution, right? Evolution in scholarship, especially in Africa, that was subject to Western norms, Western standards, right? And you're saying these are changing now, right? Maybe you're getting better data.
Yes, I don't think we can change. We have to open up the field to diverse views. But I don't want to suggest that the field changes in that what was acceptable in terms of quality no longer is. I think it's about making sure that I can communicate the robustness of evidence to somebody who's never been to Africa, who doesn't want to come to Africa, but who is interested in a topic that happens to be especially well found in Africa. I'll give an example. We're trying to understand, how do firms in Zimbabwe survive? There are still firms in the formal economy in Zimbabwe who have survived 20 years of criminal mismanagement. Now, by the time a scholar reads a paper about firm survival under those conditions, they're not necessarily interested in Zimbabwe. They're interested in firm survival. But we have to be able to explain to them that when a Zimbabwean firm does X or says Y, we need to back it up in such a way that we connect with a global body of scholarship. We can't afford to fracture scholarship. We need to have a global conversation. But I am pushing for a more diverse conversation where more voices can be heard. Perfect.
Well, Helena, for the sake of time, what is a question that I should have asked you but haven't?
It's probably more of a comment than a question, and that has to do with the diversity of voices. I was thinking the other day about John Dunning, and the one thing that I remember of him more than anything he ever taught me in terms of content was his intellectual generosity. I never heard him, when he disagreed with somebody, he always started from the point of view that maybe that person has a valid point. And I think that in international business, part of what attracts me to the field is the fact that we understand that context matters. But this respect for a diversity of views, this opening up for different ways of understanding and making sense of the world, I think for me that is really the one thing that I value of being a part of this community.
Thank you so much. This was very helpful. This was very informative. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you, Helena.
Thank you very much.